everybody. My name is Dr. Padmini Sukumaran, and I am delighted to explore with you how wonder has a continuum across the genres of fairyland fiction, fairy tale, and nursery rhyme, and across media. I will begin by providing you with an overview on all those genres as well as their historical development. So, fairyland fiction features the construction of a secondary imagined world, fairyland, that is distinct from everyday reality. The worlds are populated by supernatural beings and enchanted environments, also known as fairyland. Reality operates under altered or symbolic laws of causality. The core features of the genre are invented fairyland landscapes such as in forests, courts, palaces, enchanted realms, and supernatural or symbolic inhabitants such as fairies or other such magical spirits. And the core features are the invented fairyland landscapes such as forests, courts, palaces, enchanted realms, supernatural or symbolic inhabitants such as fairies, spirits, magical figures, and narrative grounded in imaginative rather than realistic logic, and draws from oral tradition but developed through literary and theatrical forms. And the functions of fairyland fiction are that fairyland fiction constructs symbolic and allegorical worlds of meaning, explores moral, psychological, political, and philosophical ideas through fantasy structures, and uses enchantment to reorganize perception and interpretation of reality, employs poetic or theatrical performances as a medium of imaginative experience, and transforms wonder into sustained allegorical and interpretive systems. And examples are Sir Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, an allegorical epic that is structured through poetic form, and William Shakespeare the Bard's A Midsummer Night's Dream, which features a theatrical fairy world shaped through performance and illusion. And the development of this genre is as that it emerges from medieval and Romance traditions, and it's rooted in allegory, as I mentioned, chivalric ideals and symbolic worlds, and develops into a structured literary world or secondary world. And we have, as I mentioned, a key literary lineage, which is in The Faerie Queene. It's an allegorical epic world building, and A Midsummer Night's Dream, a dramatic enchanted space. There's a core shift from allegorical romance narratives to internally governed imaginative worlds, rather secondary realities. And next we deal with the genre of fairy tale, which you're probably familiar with. It's a narrative that is rooted in oral storytelling and later transitioned into a stabilized literary form, and it's usually short and episodic and sometimes performative. It's centered upon magical events that encode cultural meaning and moral logic. The key features or the core features are there are recurring magical figures and objects such as fairies, and there are narrative patterns of transformation, trial, and resolution. It is, as the Fairyland-Fiction, dependent upon imaginative logic rather than realistic causality, and there is a movement from oral circulation to literary codification, and the functions are to translate oral storytelling traditions to structured literary systems, and then there are to convey morals and organize ethical meaning accordingly, use framing systems that are embedded, moral, editorial, performative, to guide interpretation and to preserve cultural memory while adapting across media and historical contexts. Examples are Charles Perrault's fairy tales such as Cinderella, a literary moralization of the oral tale, and then there are the Grimm brothers, fairy tales such as Hansel and Gretel, which are folkloric collections and sponsor editorial framing. Fairy tale tradition developed from early wonder tales, oral wonder narratives, into increasingly formalized literary structures shaped by shifting frame systems, and the origins with the wonder tales took place in the pre-16th century and were traditional wonder narratives that circulated orally across Europe. And then there was, in the late 16th century in Italy, there was Straparola, who introduced framed tale collections, such as in the Facetious Knights, and established early embedded narrative organization. Then in the 17th to early 18th century in France, there was, in 17th century Italy, Giambattista Basile developed allegorical cycles in the Tale of Tales, and which refined literary transformation of oral wonder tale material. And in 17th to early 18th century in France, Madame d'Aulnay expands embedded fairy tales within salon culture and literary framing, such as in Histoire des Politiques, Comte de Douglas, one of the earliest attestations of fairy tale, Conte de Fées in French, and a key example of embedded narrative formation. And in late 17th century France, Charles Perrault codifies moralized literary fairy tales within print culture and explicit in structural framing. And in 19th century Germany, the Brothers Grimm systemized oral folklore into national collections through editorial and cultural framing. And now we get to the nursery rhyme genre. You would know it as short, rhythmic, and mnemonic forms, usually performed orally, and we find that they circulate through repetition, memory, and musical structure, and entertain, instruct, and sometimes subtly comment upon society. I have found, when I was growing up and reading the children's magazine highlights, that that a lot of people turned to nursery rhymes as a way to subtly poke fun at major figures of power for which they would otherwise have been imprisoned. And as children, we do not understand much of the underlying meaning, but as adults, we can understand it better. And as I mentioned, much of the nursery rhymes' key elements are the oral elements, such as rhythmic and musical and performative, and it can also contain magical, whimsical, or satirical elements, and the functions are, I'll emphasize that while often appearing playful or nonsensical, they can encode moral instruction, social commentary, political satire, and cultural memory. And an example is Mother Goose's Nursery Rhymes, which is a literary framing of oral nursery rhyme tradition through maternal narrative persona. One such case is Humpty Dumpty, which is a condensed rhythmic narrative expressing imaginative logic through simple cause and effect structure and mnemonic form, and also about a major figure. And so I will now cover the development of the nursery rhyme genre. Nursery rhymes develop from a long-standing oral and performative traditions in early modern Europe, such as in the early modern period, there were rhythmic folk sayings and oral songs that circulated among children and adults that often blended play, instruction, and coded social commentary. Then in 17th to 18th century print culture, the oral rhymes began to be collected and stabilized in chapbook and popular print traditions, shifting from fluid performance to textual preservation. And in late 17th century France, then it came to be that the tradition was associated with literary framing through collections such as Tales of Mother Goose. And in 18th centuries in Great Britain and Europe, nursery rhymes are increasingly standardized in children's literature, and accordingly, through this development, nursery rhymes remain grounded in oral performance, but gradually acquire literary framing, which I love, and editorial stabilization, shifting from communal speech forms into curated cultural artifacts. I'm now very happy to delve into the frame structure. So there's an emergence of the key feature of frame structure across these genres, which feature embedded narratives, which I love, narrative personae, such as Mother Goose, I mentioned, editorial organization, moral framing and commentary, which is a consequent shaping of both telling and interpretation of stories. And the frame is a form that takes a form in metafiction and meta-theater, a lovely continuum of wonder accordingly. In Fairyland-Fiction, there is those characters who are stand-ins for reader, such as in Fairy Queen, the character Britomart interprets the magical world moralistically, and in A Midsummer Night's Dream, human protagonists mirror audience experience and explore psyche and human nature dynamics. In fairy tale and nursery rhymes, there are fictitious authors I mentioned as Mother Goose, and then in Grimm's tales, there is a subtle awareness and the frame stories and preservation of oral tradition. The effect is it highlights fictionality, enhances enchantment, and strengthens moral purpose. And Mother Goose is a narrative persona and cultural bridge, such as in fairy tales and nursery rhyme. She's a fictitious author figure, and she first appeared in Tales of Mother Goose by Charles Perrault in fairy tales, and she is later reinforced in English nursery rhyme collections, and she functions as a constructive narrative persona rather than a historical author, and the audience was familiar with such maternal storytelling voices. It's especially the case that that fairy tales and nursery rhymes are associated with old wives or wet nurses, and there are literary precedents that shape this reception, such as Edmund Spenser's Mother Hubbard, and then Madame d'Aulnoy's association with the Mother Bunch persona, and so accordingly we have a sense of caregiving with these maternal figures, which really directs us towards moralistic education. Mother Goose is a cross-genre influence, as I said, in the fairy tales as well as nursery rhymes, and that highlights fictionality, guides moral and playful interpretation, and connects Fairyland-Fiction, fairy tale, and nursery rhyme. Metafiction, accordingly, invites allegorization. I've given you an example with Mother Goose, as the reader or character stand-ins encourage reflection upon story events, and magical or whimsical contexts highlight moral and ethical dilemmas, and there is accordingly an allegorical interpretation of characters' actions and transformations, which accordingly encourage audience or readership to link story to personal, social, or historical contexts. Since antiquity, literature has been debated as either pleasurable entertainment or moral intellectual instruction. All of these genres collapse this distinction as imaginative pleasure becomes the vehicle of interpretation, and all of the allegory, rhythm, humor, wonder, and performance sustain audience engagement while simultaneously conveying the moral system, social commentary, cultural values, and psychological meaning. Fairyland-Fiction fuses entertainment and instruction through allegorical and performative structure. Salon storytelling demonstrates both entertainment and intellectual exchange. Fairy tales employ magical transformations and narrative pleasure to structure ethical and symbolic interpretation, and nursery rhymes encode instruction accordingly. And so, entertainment and instruction operate together as mutually reinforcing narrative functions rather than opposing literary purposes. And I really love to reflect upon the imaginative logic, which is the internal reasoning of a fictional world that supports moral, allegorical, and narrative purposes. And we have those such cases in Fairyland-Fiction, in fairy tale and nursery rhyme, such as in The Fairy Queen, Cinderella and Humpty Dumpty, respectively. I will now delve into medium and transmission. So these genres evolve across multiple media, such as oral storytelling, poetic performance, and theatrical staging and print culture. Medium shapes narrative authority, audience reception, interpretive structure, and cultural legitimacy. And so, medium does not merely transmit narrative, it actively shapes how meaning is produced, framed, and interpreted. Finally, across all of these genres, meaning is produced through the interaction of four independent systems: framing, logic, allegory, and medium. Framing structures interpretation before and during narration. Imaginative logic governs internal narrative causality. Allegory emerges from the combination of imaginative logic and framing. Medium and transmission determine how stories are shaped and stabilized, and collaboratively these systems ascertain that storytelling is never neutral transmission but a structured process of meaning making. And so messages and morals in these genres are not directly stated, they are produced through the interaction of framing systems, imaginative logic, allegorical structure, and the medium of transmission. Thank you very much.